This is Dave Gaddis, and today we're interviewing Jim Duncan here in Austin on the 9th of December 2014. Welcome, Jim. Why don't we start off by telling us when and where you were born?
I was born in Wewoka, Oklahoma, a small town in central Oklahoma, capital of the Seminole Nation, and my two school teachers. And lived in Oklahoma until I was about 6, 7. In fact, mostly all in the central area. Lived in a town called Sulphur for 2 years while my dad was in World War II. He was drafted. But right after he came back from Europe, we headed for Texas and moved to Corpus Christi. And so I grew up in Corpus, graduated from high school there. I might just say that my first vision of Austin was in 1946 on our way south. I fell in love with the town then, and so I've always really called Austin my hometown. I couldn't wait to get back here. And after I graduated from high school, I went to junior college for a couple of years in Corpus. Really couldn't afford to come to the big city and big town that quickly. Came up here in '59 to Austin in journalism. In fact, I was going to be a journalist. That was my career. I'd gotten a job with Corpus Christi Caller-Times in the summers, and sort of the transition to my discovering planning was an interesting one in a way. I was in journalism school here at UT, and went back to Corpus that summer and was working as an intern, and went out for a beer after work one day with a reporter that I highly regarded. He was an award-winning political affairs, and I told him I was sort of divided between city management was what we really defined it then, because I discovered that when I came here to Austin. I had another prof here in Austin that I was sort of a mentor who was the father of city management in a sense in Texas. He had written the Texas government book when I'd had a high school. And he actually was the father of the LBJ school. A lot of people don't even give him credit for that. He was on the city council here in Austin. He had all the credentials.
Who was that?
Stu McCorkle.
Okay.
I could get off on Stu's career because I admired him so much, and he had so much to do with my career. He had been appointed to the Planning Commission here in Austin in '48. He had been elected to the City Council in '52, very conservative Republican, but he was one of the first votes for equal opportunity for our minority people. And so he was sort of that type of person, a social progressive and a fiscal conservative, which is that's what I kind of feel I am. So anyhow, make a long story short, I graduated from UT. I switched my major my senior year to government from journalism. Got a job in the Texas State Legislature in 1961 as a legislative aide to a Corpus Christi representative. Graduated.
And which rep was that? Which state representative was that?
Travis Peeler.
Okay.
Travis Peeler. Again, he was I think the only Republican in the legislature that year, but he was such a good person. I mean, he never wanted to. He hated to be lobbied. Okay, I mean, he hated that part of it. In fact, on some bills, he would actually go out into the hallway and tell me to give me instructions on how to push the buttons. That's illegal, but I sat there, and just quickly on that in '61, I think it was 57th legislature. Some really fascinating people. Sitting 2 desks to my right was Ben Barnes, it was his first session. Sitting behind me, 4 rows was. Bob Eckhart, who became a congressman, and his daughter just got elected here in Austin as the chair of the commission. I mean, so it was fascinating, just the people that I was able to expose to. Charlie, the guy from Lufkin who got the movie made after him, I forgot his last name anyhow.
Wilson. Wilson?
Charlie Wilson, who was in that session. So that was my introduction to Texas politics. But I was walking across campus on August the 12th, 1961, and I ran into Stu McCorkle there on the pavilion. And he said, "What are you going to do, Jim?" And I talked about getting a master's in public administration, but I was broke, tired, and nobody wants to leave Austin. I think if you ask anybody who graduates from UT, their preference would be able to stay here. And he said, "Well, I think there's a job down at City Hall. Why don't you go on down there in the city manager's office?" So I ran down there that afternoon, walked into the door, and the city manager's aide said, "Oh, I just filled it yesterday." Turned around to press, getting ready to walk out. He said, "But I think there may be a job up on the 3rd floor in the planning department." Rushed up there. Hoyle Osmond was the planning director. And And the job was Dick Lilly's job. Dick was getting ready to leave to go to Georgia Tech to get a master's. So Dick and I had a 30-day, that was my introduction to planning. I mean, I didn't even know what planning was until, but I really, I loved it. I wasn't a planner. I was a research analyst. Okay, that was the guy that just did all the data collection, which was the perfect job because it gave you an opportunity to, really. And I worked a year, and I knew I wanted to get a master's. I wanted to, because and this was in 1960. Well, I worked in Austin 61, 63, so 2 years, almost to the day. And I wanted to get a master's, but at that time there was no planning school in Texas. In fact, there were only about there weren't many planning schools. And so I considered 3, Oklahoma, Georgia Tech, North Carolina. The interesting thing on that is, part of the reason there wasn't a planning school here is that they'd been arguing over, they knew about planning, but UT had been arguing over where to put it. God, I forgot his name. I really liked him. The architecture school wanted it in architecture, and Stu wanted it in public affairs. All right. And as I understand the story, they didn't create the program until mid-60s, 65, 66. I don't know the year they actually started it. But they finally compromised that Stu would get his Institute of Public Affairs and architecture would get planning. So those decisions are sort of interesting how they make it. And of course, the Institute of Public Affairs ultimately became the LBJ school, which, so that's why I always say that Stu had probably more to do with the LBJ school, even though he, so after 2 years, almost to the day, I headed off to OU. I was up there from 63 to 65, probably the best decision I ever made in terms of academics. It was just a perfect school. I ended up, well, this was, I've always said that they let me in on probation because I had the lowest grade point average at UT of any student ever to graduate without having been on probation, which meant it was a 1.0. In those days, it was a 3-point system, so it was because I always enjoyed life a little bit more than I enjoyed the books. Plus, the senior year, I was carrying 7 courses and working 30 hours a week in the legislature, and I enjoyed the legislature more than the courses. So anyhow, I went up there and they let me in. I was really close because the chair of the Georgia Tech program I liked a lot, and I'd met him. But Oklahoma was sort of home, and I had relatives. And that was a good decision because when I got up there, my grandparents lived only about 25 miles from Norman, and so I was able to go down there once a month. And my grandfather died about a year afterwards, so I was able to spend some time with, so personal. Even today, I got relatives. Most of my relatives are in Oklahoma, not in Texas.
Do you remember some of the professors and maybe some of your fellow students during that time?
Do I what?
Do you remember some of the professors and some of the students?
That's sort of the end of this story. Let me go to the end and I'll show you. Okay. Yes, I've always been close to the campus, to OU. And I don't want to get off on this interview, but I've always felt like that there is too big of a gap between planning academics and planning practice. It's just been something that's bothered me, and I've met too many planning academics who have no idea whatsoever what's out there. And even skirting, I'll be coming back. I spent a lot of time in Florida, and one of the things I was so excited about in Florida, we had 3 planning schools, and when I was president of the Florida APA chapter, we involved all 3 schools intimately into it, and they all really did. And they had, Florida State was the first college to ever have a planning practitioner on board. And even today, of the 85 accredited schools, only 12 have people on board who have actually had practice. And either private or public. I'm not saying they could have been a designer with a firm like Friesen Nichols, but at least they know what the real world is. And we don't have enough of that. So, but OU always has done a good job of that. But about a year ago, I was up there, and I'm on the board of visitors at the university, and I was having lunch with the chair of my program. 50 years. He's 92 years old today. And it was his birthday the next month, and I thought, well, we need to get everybody together. So for the past year, one of my special projects had been finding and contacting all of the graduates of the OU program since 1949. All right? There's 700 of them, and I contacted 500 of them, and I put them into a book. All right, did a profile, a little 10-line profile of everybody, and we had a reunion on October 4th in which 200 of them showed up. And the fascinating part of the OU program is that it's not categorized. I mean, like a Harvard or MIT, there's a certain template of a type of person. OU grads have gone everywhere and done everything and done it pretty well. And I was just saying earlier, in the Metroplex, the track record in that area, because there's a lot of them. The Metroplex is strong with OU graduates. It's fascinating. One of my classmates, who I hadn't seen in 50 years, but it was like we'd been just yesterday, was the architect of record for the Biosphere 2 outside of Tucson, which was that famous 2-year experiment where 8 people went in and never came out until, they've just done some interesting things. So that's sort of one of the things that I get my jollies on today in doing, and the other I mentioned earlier is working on. But let's go back. So 63, I went to OU, only bachelor and 17 students, so unfortunately my social life didn't slow down much. And when I graduated in 65, planners were such in demand you wouldn't believe it. I mean, I really have felt sorry when I've seen students, in the last 10 years who can't find a job so quickly. But I sent out 42 letters and got 41 offers. And I had the lowest grade point average in the class. All right, I'm not proud of that, it just happened to be. And I've always been interested in going where the action is. I've never, in fact, this was sort of strange. 65 was a key year because I happened to be accidentally president of 2 of the most significant civil rights events of that year. I was heading to Florida and crossed the Selma Bridge the day after Martin Luther King did, and all the troops were still camped out along the road. But I was going to Florida to look for a job, okay? And then my first job was in California. When I was out there, I was with a friend in the Hollywood Hills, and we watched watch burn. So, I mean, it was sort of, all of this stuff was happening at the time that I was, so when I looked at all the job offers, the weirdest thing in the world, the highest job offer I was given was the state of Alabama in Montgomery. That's the last place I wanted to go in 1965. They offered me $9,000, which was a lot of money in 1965. Ended up taking the job as planning director of the fastest growing city in California. Camarillo had just incorporated right outside of LA for $7,200. Loved it. I mean, it was just, the thing is that I got out there and about 8 months, 9 months, I had a friend who was working with a consulting firm in San Francisco, and he kept saying, "Hey, Jim, you got to come up here. San Francisco's the place to be, especially for bachelors." I mean, this is. So I finally, resigned and went up there, and I was with this firm. Offices right in the heart of San Francisco on Union Square, on Maiden Lane, right off Union Square. Got me an apartment on Pacific Heights overlooking Alcatraz, sort of the ideal. And this was 2 years before Haight-Ashbury. I'm putting all this in the context for people before San Francisco really became a centroid of the hippie movement. And I was there, I think, not more than 2 months, because I just moved into my apartment, and the executive director of the firm came in and said, "Jim, we've got an office in Seattle that is 120 architects." At the time, the firm I was with was the 3rd largest A&E firm in the country, Leo Daly.
What was the name of the firm?
Leo Daly, out of Omaha's home office. And he said, they're doing well. They've got all the architectural contracts for United Airlines and Boeing and all that, building hangars. But we have a progressive architect. He wants to expand into planning because of the Pacific Northwest. So I said, "Sounds good to me." I mean, I was an ambitious little cuss. And I said, "Which way Seattle?" I had no idea. And so I took off up there. Well, I was up there for 2 years, and it was, again, very good experience. But when I had gone to Florida to interview to look for a job, and that was back in 65, I had sort of circled the state and had 7 job interviews. And actually, I had 6 offers of those 7. The only one that didn't offer me a job was Broward County, and they had a civil service rule that you had to live in the county a year before they could hire you, which was pretty stupid, which tells you why some counties didn't, there's not any planners that are going to go live there and wash cars for a year before they're hired. So anyhow, but I decided it wasn't exactly the right job. It's kind of strange. I think I knew what I was looking for, even though I didn't know what I was, I got a call from the planning director in Dade County, Miami, saying, "Hey, Jim, we've created that job we talked about." And what it was a division chief, they called it local planning services, which I would be sort of a public consultant to the 27 cities in Dade County. I would provide them, it was sort of a stepping stone to what I ultimately became as a consultant, but I was in the public sector. But the cities paid the county for my services. Fantastic. I worked there 5 years.
And what years were those?
That was 67 to 72.
Okay.
And some of these things, it's just being in the right place at the right time, and that's been a lot of my career. Florida, there was an awakening in Florida about in the early 70s. They had pretty much raped the country in the 60s. And in 1972, I got a call from the city manager in Hollywood, which was the biggest, second biggest city in Broward County to the north, saying, and the headline that week, I remember, or the couple of weeks before, was the City of Hollywood abolishes planning department. And so the city manager calls me and says, how would you like to be my city planner? Well, the first reaction was, but what is this? I mean, you don't even know. He said, no, you don't understand. It's the story behind the headlines. We just had an election. We had five new city council members. And it is probably the most pro-planning move, because what happened is we had a planning staff that was not qualified. They'd been moved up through civil service. Remember, I mentioned to you about Broward's mentality. And they were meter readers, and they didn't know how to do planning. And all of a sudden, the city was growing at 10% a year, and the citizens got upset, so they hired a very pro-growth management council. And he said, in fact, if you'll take this job, the very first mission would be to change the name of the department, because planning is a bad word. So I went up. Started in January '73. My first mission was to change the name of the department. We created the Department of Growth Management, the first department in the entire United States to be called growth management. And that word actually then became the predicate in Florida statewide of a lot of things, which was kind of interesting. And we did a lot of interesting things, which, let me just, actually, I put this together, and I'm not going to go through this thing too much, but this is sort of a photo thing, but it reminds me of things that we did. Well, here, for example, let me just show you. These were four of the projects we did in Dade County. These were plans. This was it shows you the variety. This was a town for Sweetwater, the first city in the country to have a Cuban mayor. We did the plan in Spanish and English. This was Homestead, Florida City. This was South Miami, the first plan in the country to incorporate the word consistency, which then became the foundation of Florida's. This was North Bay Village. The mayor of this town was my age. He's the city, he's the highest ranking person in Dade County still today. All right, a good friend of mine. This was a multiple use study. In the 60s, the interstate system cut through cities and destroyed neighborhoods. This was one of the first studies contracted by DOT to try to bring the neighborhoods back by using the land underneath the expressways. But we did a lot of innovative stuff, is the point. Then I had a little interlude there, but I was with the Miss Universe pageant. This Pearl Bailey, you remember Pearl? Went to Europe, met my wife. That's just not the professional part of it. Married my wife, came back to Miami, lived on Miami Beach. Oh, here. In Hollywood. Loved that town. We did the Hollywood Tomorrow plan, which won the state APA award. We did negotiating 3 islands. We bought the largest urban wetlands in the United States. This is three square miles of mangroves in between Fort Lauderdale Airport and City of Hollywood. Ran for the legislature, got beat. So, was appointed to the governor. This is Bob Graham, who was the governor at the time, ultimately became senator. He created the Resource Management Task Force. Actually, for 3 years, I started a consulting firm and did a lot of different things. This was some work at Lake Worth, Broward County, in 81. Economy got bad. Consulting work got slim. I'd been offered a job with Broward County, so I took the director's job there. And I was there for 3 years. Actually, we put into place the first impact fees, non-utility impact fees in the country in the late 70s. And they needed somebody to establish a program. And so I took the administration of that. Let's see, I think came to Austin in '64. I've always leaned, I've always felt like if you're going to be a planning director, there has to be a balance between public and private issues, and I think you will know what I'm talking about there. But I've always felt like that the private sector, especially in places like Texas, has had the edge. It's tilted a little bit too much that way. One of my proudest moments was, this is a letter which I've put into here, is when I resigned to start my consulting firm. It's a letter from the president of the African American neighborhood in East Austin. It's a fuzzy, nice thank you for all you've done for our state planners, which I was real proud of. This is just some of the stuff we did. Some of the ordinances. I was planning director here for 3 years, or we called it Development Office of Land Development Services Director, because I was in charge of the regulatory end of it. That was one of the things that happened here, and going back to a little bit of history. Dick probably gave you some of this, but Dick had worked his way back to Austin after he graduated. He'd come back to Waco, and there wasn't anything opportunity for him, but he waited, and he was planning director here, so it was the second time I'd replaced Dick Lilly. But Austin had started booming, and the structure wasn't ready for it, and the staff wasn't ready for it, and so they had reorganized, and they had created a planning and a regulatory end, and they hired me for the regulatory end, and then I have a friend, Norm Standifer, who came up with me from Florida and took the planning end. But it was a mess. Austin was the 7th fastest growing city in the country at the time, just like sort of today. But it was the first time anybody had been exposed to it. And I remember I met an attorney the first day I walked in the door, and he was so excited he had a piece of property that flipped 7 times the day before. And I said, well, that's real good for the entrepreneur and speculator, but what's that? It was, and I would go to the city council at one time, and I said, somebody was asking for a zoning change for something. And I said, let me just put all this in perspective. Right now, you have approved more office square footage in the last 6 months than currently exists in the entire Metroplex. I said, there's a little bit, can't we slow down a little bit? Because it was just sort of the fervor of going. And we had to do some, one of the biggest things we did there was protect the hill country. What you see out the window here is that people were starting to, and we adopted hill country, pervious areas and watershed, all of those things, which are still in place today. Somewhat, they're considered pretty iconic today, but they didn't exist at that time.
And so, what years were you director in Austin?
74. No, excuse me, 8. Okay, let me get the years. I was I left. I left the city of Hollywood in '77. Oh, I did forget. Whenever I announced that I was resigning and starting a consulting firm, I got a call from the city of Miami Beach, and they asked me if I would be interested in being executive director of the Redevelopment Authority, South Beach. I don't know if you've ever been to Miami. Today, it's up. In the mid '70s, it was dying. Okay, it had a lot of Cuban immigrants. It had a lot of elderly Northeastern Jewish grandparents who had been dumped. It was just and so I said, well, that's not really my style, but they offered me a lot of money, and so I said, I'll give you 6 months. I went down there, and at the end of the 5th month, I gave 30 days notice. But it was an experience, and I was there, and because I was able to help people like Barbara Capitman, who was the woman who preserved the Art Deco, which is now if you ever look at Miami Beach, South Beach, that's the whole essence of their economy. So, and like I said, 6 months, 5 months, and then I started the consulting firm, 3 years. In '81, I went with the county, Broward, and in '84, I had actually, in the spring of '84, I was at a planning conference in Minneapolis, and I ran into one of the Austin City Council people, Sally Shipman, who was sort of a leader of the smart growth movement here, and she said, heard you're from Austin, and you're doing interesting things in Florida. You'd be interested in coming home? And I said, well, let me think about it. And the timing was really good because I had a 6-year-old son. My parents were getting old, and it was a family thing. So I said, and they were living in San Antonio. So we decided to come back. So I didn't leave Florida. As a matter of fact, I had been elected president of the Florida APA chapter, and then I had been elected without opposition for the second term just before I took this job. Because we were just getting the Florida chapter of APA. Let me go into that because that relates to this. In the 70s, Florida was a fascinating place. I mean, I always have said it's probably the best decision I ever made to go down there because it was an urban laboratory when it comes to our professional organization. We had a lot of little groups around the state because Florida is very diverse. I mean, you got the southern part, the Panhandle, and the central, and we had little meetings. So we did the very first come together type thing in 1982. We had the first statewide APA conference, and I had good connections with the governor. Well, actually, I had the lieutenant governor come speak, which was a big deal back then. So we really started, and then for about 3 years, we had. In 1982, in Fort Lauderdale, we had 250 people at the conference. The next year in Boca Raton, we had 500. And the next year in Orlando, we had 700. This was in 1984, 700 planners at a planning conference. That's not a bad number for today in Texas, okay, which is, and then I was followed by Ron Short. Did you ever meet Ron?
Yeah.
And Ron was pretty progressive too. So we got the.
And I'll bring you back to this point, but why don't we go back to when you first got involved in AIP and ASPO? How did you find out about those organizations?
Well, I got involved early. Let me tell you, okay, this is good. I don't know why. The very first conference I ever went to was in 1964, and it was in Boston. It was the ASPO conference, and I think it was because our teachers told us it was important to get out into, the world was bigger than Norman, Oklahoma. And I remember we drove up there with 4 students, and because I remember little things on the way. The World's Fair in New York, I remember seeing the big globe in 65. We went to Toronto. And I remember we went to St. Louis, and the arch was like that. It was still the gap. I mean, I took a photograph, and I lost it a long time ago. I wish I'd had that as a historic picture. So, I mean, I can sort of relate it to, we went through Detroit before it had, in fact, Detroit was a major city back then. I mean, Doxiadis, who was a big planning consultant out of Greece, had done this master plan for them. I mean, the 60s was an exciting time. Some of the biggest books in planning were written in the early 60s. I mean, Kevin Lynch's site planning and, oh God, what's the woman who the new urbanists idolized? Jane Jacobs. She came out with her book. I mean, just all of these things. There was an awakening. It couldn't have been a more magnificent time to come into a profession that there was such a great need, and you were there to help fill that need. You know what I mean? And it was sort of the responsibility was really important. But anyhow, so I started early.
Do you remember when you took the AIP exam?
Yeah. Well, no, I didn't take it. Okay. In the 60s, they didn't have an exam. They didn't start that until the early 70s. My very first job in Camarillo, all you had to have was 3 sponsors back then. And I hadn't even worked a year because that was my first job. And I remember 3 of the planning sponsors on Ventura County sponsored me, and I became an AIP member in, I think, 68 or 69. Okay. So, and then they started the...
And did you get involved in chapter activities?
Not in California.
Okay.
In Florida, in a big way. Okay. Yeah, in fact, it was kind of funny. I started in the late 60s, in the late 70s. I think I started the first secretary. I wasn't secretary treasurer, but maybe vice president or something. And well, this wasn't a good me. I mentioned that I was elected president in 79, I guess, 2-year term. But I was vice president, and my president, who was a good friend of mine, did something wrong, and they impeached him. What he had done, he had taken his wife to a planning conference in Denver, and he had spent a lot of money, and the rest of the board got pissed, okay? And so they basically said, bye. And so I got elevated. So I actually spent part of his term as president. I had a long run as president of the Florida chapter.
Okay, so in the mid-'80s, you leave Florida?
I leave Florida and come back here for 3 years in Austin.
Okay.
Wild experience. City was booming. We had a lot to do, had no plan. I will go back and say that well, no, I don't use that. There was a plan in '58 that we used, but that's not part. They had been working on a zoning code. which we adopted. I had nothing to do with drafting it. I mean, we massaged it, but I was responsible. I did a whole series. The city council pretty much rubber stamped everything we did because we were considered, I mean, the neighbors were upset.
You remember some of the staff people?
Oh yeah, big. They didn't have adequate staff, and I doubled the staff. What they did to create the department when they moved Dick out, they consolidated people from 7 different departments. This was going to be the ultimate agency, regulatory agency. I had people from the fire department, I had building and zoning, I had everything, anything regulatory, and then I hired 80 more people. All right. Since I had a good network of around the country, I was able to hire pretty good people around. Plus, timing is always important. We were in a recession in the early '80s, and Austin has always had a good reputation. So I mean, I went to actually in '81 when I hired for Broward County in Boston, I had the pick of the crop. I remember we hired 35 there. Then when I came here, we had the same thing. We were able to get some really good people. So I had a staff of 160 here, and we rode the crest for a couple of years, and then the bottom fell out. All right, and we had funded the department basically on permit fees, so when we realized we had to tighten our belt, I went into city manager and I said, now first thing we got a little bit of a problem here because we just can't let it be last in, first out. I said, Austin's going to suffer because basically the staff we had hired was, in my opinion, a lot more qualified than the staff that existed, which, except you need a mix is what you need. You need some people who have the history and some people who have the freshness. So everybody worked well. I mean, it was probably one of the proudest moments. Personnel let us come up with a point system. I mean, in other words, it wasn't just last in, first out. It was a lot of other things. And then we basically told the city manager, I said, I want my primary mission right now to be finding jobs for everybody, which we did. And the city gave everybody, we were releasing a round-trip ticket anywhere they wanted for an interview. We would come up on Saturdays and help them rewrite their resumes. I mean, we did everything we could. And we had great people. I had a staff member that went directly to the assistant director in San Diego, one was sent assistant director in Tucson. I mean, it was a lot of them went out consulting. Every planning director here in Austin since I left has been off from my staff. Okay. It worked out good. It worked out good for them, and it worked out good for me because after all the dust settled, I went in and told the city manager that I was not hired to, do this. I mean, I knew that the timing was not bad for me to start a consulting firm because I had pretty good roots in Florida. I'd just been elected president of the National APA, so all the things, and it was a good timing. So.
Okay. So you started your consulting
Started
firm
consulting in 1987.
Okay.
And
what are some of the projects, or do you specialize?
Well, we had, I had gotten way past wanting to do comp plans. All right, I guess I'm more of a rubber hits the road type of person. We had a niche which we knew was solid in impact fees because I had the specialty on that coming out of Florida, and they were starting to look good in the 80s because we were going through Reaganomics and governments had dollar issues. So, so we focused on codes and impact fees. And I know that we started the firm in '87. I can't remember some of the early ones we got, but a couple of moves. In '91, we'd never really gone for a big fish. And I got an RFP from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I said, we never had gone for anything outside the South either, but we put in a proposal and we got it. And that sort of led us to be able to get some big city projects. Since that time, we've done a lot of big cities. We've done Chicago, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Kansas City, Atlanta, and I brought one person with me off that staff. Two really. I got one immediately and then one year, and they're still with me 30 years later. Kirk Bishop and Clancy Mullen. Kirk operates the Chicago office, and Clancy's here in Austin, does all of our impact fees. And And we're at a point after 30 years that we don't do a lot. We don't hardly marketing. We don't do. A lot of it is repeat business. Our impact fee work is almost all repeat business, because they have to renew them every 3 years, and that keeps us busy.
Well, you had mentioned that after being Florida president, you were elected a national president. Was that a direct move, or did you?
Yeah, that was an interesting move at the time because I was starting a consulting firm at the same time, so I was juggling balls. But obviously, being president of the national gives you some high profile, so it doesn't hurt your consulting business. It helps it in profile, but it hurts it in taking time away from starting a firm. So there's a balance there.
Do you remember some of the issues during your presidency? Or
Oh yeah,
accomplishments?
Major issues. The major thing about, well, Bruce McClendon had been president before I had, and Bruce, you know Bruce well. He's one of my best friends. He's sort of a bomb thrower. He rattles cages, but he was good because we came in just after APA and ASPO and AIP had merged, and it was a unique period because. ASPO had been more of an information type agency run by S. Stolman, in other words, an education and all that, where AIP had been more of a chapter oriented, more localized type. And so I'd love to hear this, but it took him a while, he was an old timer, to remember that it's important. So I was really the first president that represented chapters. I'd come in. I had been elected to the Chapter President's Council, and there was a lot of young Turks on there at the time, and because I remember one of the chapter presidents that I'd gotten close to in the early 80s when I was president of the Florida chapter, because that's what I got, was a woman named Karen Smith in Colorado, magnificent lady. Her future was unlimited, and in fact, we were talking about running her for president of APA, and she died on a highway outside of Aspen. Well, it must have been just before I did, because then we started looking for somebody else, and I got picked to run. But the timing, I mean, Connie Cooper was. In fact, Connie Cooper was elected chair. I was vice chair, and Angela was one of my best quotes ever, and they still remind me of this after 30 years. Is first day we were elected, we were sitting up in front of all the chapter presidents, and I looked around and I said, "Thorn between two roses." Because Angela Martin, and the reason I hesitate, she's been married twice before. You know who I'm talking about.
Angela Harper now.
Angela Harper, exactly. Tall, striking Virginian. And so that was really the catalyst. And then I ran, which was good because I ran against, back in those days there was a guy, I forgot his name now, but he had his own design for APA, and he had been president the year before. And but I was in a good position because I'd come from Florida and I was now in Texas, and if you're going to run for office, that's two pretty good states to have a chapter base from, and it's a lot better than Oklahoma or Louisiana. And so anyhow, I got elected. And it was a great 4 years. Let's see here. Went to the Soviet Union, represented under Reagan. Let's see. I think some of these are on the APA somewhere. So this was my staff in Austin. And Greg's the director right now, and there's Greg. There was Alice Glasgow. And actually one person he may be ready is Watson. I hired him as my assistant director. He followed me, and he's retired here in Austin now. Do you know?
Right.
Yeah. These are the guys that worked for me. Been worked all for me for 30 years. Those are our different offices, staff members. Some of the early stuff when we were marketing.
I have that bumper sticker in my office.
The one that went over good was World Peace through better zoning. Right. Our clients. Here's some of the projects that talk about. I did co-author this book here with Chris Nelson.
Which which, by the way, I've used in some of my college classes.
I would never have done it, except we had done a study for Seattle.
Right.
And Chris was looking at it one day. He said, "This would make a great book." And you know how academics think in terms of writing books. And I said, "Oh, okay." So we did it together. And this is the project that really was. It was a fiscal study in Florida. Actually, we did we took 8 different areas and sort of a slice of what the taxes were being paid and what it cost to service it. It was the first time a good friend of mine, he's chair of the program at Rutgers now, the biggest one in the country. He wrote the fiscal impact analysis book. Burchell. Yeah, well, Bob. Bob loves that book. He said, I said, well, it's not near as complicated as yours. He said, yeah, but it's real world. Yeah, you know, and it was, it took the academics. We did the Chicago Code. We did impact fees, Phoenix, and this was a legal book we did for Chicago metro area. That's just some typical ones.
Well, have you stayed active in APA since your presidency?
No, I haven't. This was when we were chair. I mean, the board we had, that was in San Antonio. This was New York. There's Koch, Stolman, Cisneros.
I may be in one of those pictures.
Yeah. You remember at the
we went to Gracie Mansion.
This was I was proud of this. I was a member of the first class of fellows.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. Tell me about that.
It's just an honor. We have a great group of people. You look at some of the faces there. Carol Barrett was in that class.
Right. And what year was that?
70. I don't. God, you get to be my age. What year does that say? 2000.
Okay.
Yeah. And here, my icon here, Ian McCarg, and Peter Calthorpe was a good friend of mine. He was on that Russia trip with me. I met Peter back in '89. Here's some of my. I've always been very proud of some of that mean that's not here, but John DeGrove. He is truly the father of growth management in Florida. Phenomenal guy. Passed away the other day. One of my best friends is Jim Nicholas, who's just retiring. Bosselman. And you talk about conferences here. These are all conferences. You get this was in San Diego. This was in San Antonio. I'm looking at these upside down. That was in San Antonio. That's in New York. This was in Vancouver.
And there's Bruce.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we've talked about lots of people. Are there some mentors in your career that you?
Well, Stu McCorkle would be my UT mentor. Okay. I went to Del Mar College for 2 years, and a guy named J.W. Agee. Again, those were both government profs. So you sort of see where I came out of. They really made me feel a strong affinity for government and public service. Just on the side, J.W. Agee is the grandfather of, what's the actor? Nobody knows this. A little bit of trivia. The Texas Western Country for Old Men. Who's the actor? Josh Brolin.
Oh, okay.
Josh Brolin. He's yeah. In fact, J.W. had a daughter about a year older than me, and when I was at school, he would always. I think she'd been a little bit of a problematic kid, and she had taken off and gone to L.A. And out there, she had started meeting all the young movie stars, and she dated Clint Eastwood and all this. And now this is early, okay. And then she married Brolin, father. I forgot his first name, and they had Josh, and then they got a divorce. And one of the stories that I always thought was she was a wild thing. And one day she was sitting there, and he was 6 years old, and they said, "We're going to go home." This was in L.A. So they headed on I-10 I-10, Route 66 for Corpus Christi, because she wanted a Whataburger. And he still remembers that story today about his mother wanting a Whataburger, and they took off. So
how about mentors in your career after you started?
Yeah. I would say probably everybody I worked for. The director in Dade County was an early one. He gave me a lot of.
And who is that?
His name is Reg Walters.
Okay.
Georgia Tech grad, pure as the day is long. One of these guys, Baptist, he gives 10% of his money to the church. I mean, he was somebody you had to respect, even though you might not go that far yourself. And he didn't. He gave me a long leash, which I think really helped because I was there 5 years, and we were a young staff, very progressive. Dade County was one of the first, consolidated governments in the country in '58, and because of the young staff, single and everything, everybody would, be taking off for Europe and all that, and so he had a rule, you could have your vacation, and you could have 1 week free. 1 week without pay to add to it, which meant, because I was a burnout after 3 years in 1970, which meant that I wanted to go to Europe. It was just but that meant I only got 5 weeks, and I wanted to go when I wanted to buy a car. I just wanted to be free, and so I went into and resigned. I said, Reg, I respect your rule. I don't want you to make any exceptions, but I got to get out of here, and I don't want to be limited to 5 weeks. And he said, wait a minute. I think you'll be ready to come back. And he was partially right. I came back in 2 months, but I was fresh. I was ready to roll again. I stayed another 2 years before the Hollywood job called. I think a couple of mentors I had in Hollywood were not staff, but they were elected officials. They were probably two of the most honorable men. They were both Republicans. This is what's ironic, but they were their conservatism was conservation, and they were straight air. They made their money, but they made it right. They weren't corrupt, and this was important because while I was in Dade County, 2 commissions got indicted out from for zoning corruption. Okay, Florida is a little bit fast and woolly. So those 2 guys, one was a banker and one was a musician, couldn't have more. One was rich and one was poor. Of those 2 guys, one was the vice mayor and one was a council member. But it was the conservationist that really, he was the key guy to get that 3 square miles. It took his political clout, and we had to get state money, conservation money. And I did the negotiating with the developer, which, in other words, bending arms, saying you're not going to be able to use that because I ain't going to give you no zoning. In those days, we could actually down zone. I did that leverage, and they came up with some money. So we came up with something that was fair all the way around. He got money for something he couldn't have used anyhow. It had been platted in the 20s. A lot of that's in Florida. So people owned the property from all over the world, and you can never consolidate it. But yet, he owned 50% of it. So there's a lot of techniques.
The flip side is, do you have any proteges that you're particularly proud of?
Oh yeah. A ton of them. When you've hired as many people and worked with as many people as I have. It's hard to pick 1 or 2 because there's just so many of them.
Okay. Well, if you had any advice for a young planner, what would it be?
Don't lose your idealism, but don't let it drive you so much because you're going to have some down times. You got to be able to pick yourself up and keep moving, and you got to be satisfied sometime with a piece of the pie, not just the whole pie. I think that's real important. I found people who get stubborn, but probably overlying is don't ever forget that your primary purpose as a professional is to serve the public interest. And I think that's hard for some of my colleagues who are working in the private sector because I think the private sector can lead you to compromising some of your principles sometimes. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, you have experience both in the public sector and the private sector. Do you have
half and half? And I've always been proud of that. In fact, I advise people. But I always advise them to get a little bit public sector experience first. I think that's the best foundation. I don't regret any of my decisions there. I think they've all been just ridiculously fortuitous. I had a good, strong public sector career with a small taste in there, which was not super successful because the economy is as good. But then my private consulting firm has been ideal. We've kept it small. The largest we ever got was like 16, and that was too big. I got 6 people right now. And actually, I didn't mention it, but we actually did hire 2 people in Chicago who do form base. And that's a subsidiary firm. We got a firm called Codometrics. and they're so busy. But that was a woman who worked for one of the largest firms, Farr Associates, and she wanted to also have a family life, be a motherhood, wanted to work from home, and we gave her that opportunity. And she's been fantastic. And she actually was UT grad a long time ago.
So tell me a little bit about your run for political office. You said you ran.
That was a good run. That was funny. It worked out perfect. All right, I lost. All right, and I don't mean that, because in 1974 I'd been at Dade County, at Hollywood for 2 years, and I was sort of king of the hill. All right, I was the guru, the planning, and everybody was supportive of the planning, and we had a state senator in South Broward who was old and stupid. All right, he was the old guard, and he really didn't know. And he actually voted against a bill that had no meaning. It was a growth policy. It had no teeth whatsoever. It was just a bill that was thrown out there to say we need more growth management in Florida. He voted against it, and so I decided I was going to run against him. All right, it just really pissed me off. And I had a good friend. I've always had a really good rapport with the media, because I think it's part of it. I respect them, but also I came out of that with my journalism orientation. And one of my best friends at the time was a reporter for Channel 10 in Miami, which covered all of South Florida. And I told him what I was going to do, and he said, he advised me not to. He said, if you happen to lose, it'll be perceived as an anti-growth management because of the symbolics. You're a one-issue candidate, Jim. So I didn't run against him, but I threw my hat into a state representative race with 6 people running for a non-incumbent. And I went to the city council first, and I said, do you have any problem? Because I didn't want to. They said, well, actually, I was going to take a leave of absence. And they said, no, we don't want you to take a leave of absence. You can run, that's your private, but just don't collect any money from conflicts of interest. I said, don't worry about that. And be here 8 to 5, or and I agreed to all that. So it was sort of limiting. I ran with no money, and only 3 nights a week I could do anything, because and I came in third, close third, in a 6-person race, which I didn't make the runoff. If I'd made the runoff, I probably won. The irony was, there was a guy from a town called Hallandale that ran against the senator. Nice guy, but a total zero. He got 47% of the vote. It was an anti-vote. If I or anybody with any substance had run, I would become a state senator in the state of Florida in 1974, and it would have probably started a career that way. And that's not what I would like. In retrospect.
Well, you're recognized as a leader in growth management, and for the last 15 years or so, there's been a lot of backlash against growth management. What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, it's how you define growth management. There's been, there's a lot of words, smart growth. I don't think the word growth management is used. One of my things here in Austin, there's backlash against smart growth, because one of my good friends who's active in the Latino community, because of the displacement of Latinos in East Austin, because the property is getting bigger and we're getting more expensive, and we're moving over, and yuppies are taking their space. It's not place making, it's place taking, I think. But his comment was, smart growth means send Mexicans across the river today. Okay, because you've got to. They've been renting on this property for 100 years, and all of a sudden somebody comes in, the property values go up, and they can't afford to be there anymore. So there's a lot of displacement, and that's something we haven't done a very good job of. So there's negative spin-offs on smart growth. Smart growth is not just making more money, all right? And I think a lot of people perceive it as that. I was talking to Dan earlier. I think that's why form-based coding, a lot of developers support it, because they see more density, more height, more intensity. But when they realize it's prescriptive and they don't have as much flexibility in the market, sometimes they back off a little bit. They just want a wider array of latitude on what they can do. And that's much stronger here in Texas than it is in other states, I think, because of our free enterprise spirit.
We've covered a lot of material today, and I know you need to catch a flight. Is there anything else
that
you haven't talked about that you want to talk about?
I think sort of the ending. I think this is this year has been active. The University of Oklahoma gave me a very fine award earlier, and this was all my Oklahoma relatives who came to the event. And I was really proud of this. I had 4 of my 17 classmates there, and I mean, they're all fantastic. These were my 65 OU classmates. He's still working, believe it or not. He's city manager in Florida City.
And who's that?
Dennis Foltz. This is my friend, the architect, who he invented the word sustainability, literally, okay? And he's 80 years old, and he lives in a adobe hut in northeastern New Mexico. And he tooled up to the hotel that I was at in a 17-year-old Prius. I didn't even know they were that old. He's got more energy. He's the one that studied in the 50s under Frank Lloyd Wright and did the biosphere. He's the first African-American to get a planning degree in the United States.
And his name?
Malachi Knowles. He's still active. He's now, his give back period is he's created golf opportunities for minorities, and he lives in South Florida. But he was president of the First Africa Corporation. He was the undersecretary under, I mean, he's been to Washington 25 years. And he has the most conservative career. He, for 30 years, was the county administrator of Davenport, Iowa, of the county there. But I mean, they've all been successes, okay, you know what I'm saying? And I'm really proud of that group, so it...
Well, I want to thank you for taking some time with us. I appreciate you being here.